Today I'm going to help you unveil your self-critic. Hi, I'm Shelley from Underground Confidence. I help people to understand the emotional side of overeating. In my work with overeating, what I see the most is people who are really hard on themselves. This is one of the main reasons that people overeat. So this time I'm going to talk about how self-criticism goes hand in hand with comfort eating. I'll show you ways to understand this for yourself and to begin the journey of stopping giving yourself such a hard time. Because that's really what's needed to stop overeating. Self-criticism is at the heart of the reason for most comfort eating. And what's more, dieting is actually based around it. But the solution lies in not trying to be perfect, in approaching food without a diet mentality, and learning to address real needs rather than finding a fix outside yourself or about how you look. Self-criticism can take so many different forms, but here's one that you might relate to. As I mentioned when I was talking about what comfort eating is earlier in my videos, one of the most common things my clients have talked about is having doctors, personal trainers, family, friends who comment on their weight and try to restrict their eating or encourage them to exercise. So they might say something about their weight and why don't you cut back on carbs and go to Weight Watchers or something. Or they might give you smaller portions or take food away from you in an attempt to help you. I believe that these people are trying to help. They probably have good intentions. They might be well-meaning, but the result is often that the person who's listening feels criticised and ends up thinking, why can't I stop eating? There must be something wrong with me. That sentence in itself is something most people who come to me have thought lots of times. And it probably makes you want to eat when you think it. Overeating here is an instinctive, natural, normal response. How are you going to manage how you feel when you feel rubbish about what someone's just said to you about your behaviour? With all of those suppressed feelings and an apparent lack of understanding around you, you're going to use what you usually use to feel better. You're going to want to eat. Do you relate to this? Can you recognise some of this? Does it sound like you at all? Another way that comfort eaters criticise themselves is by characterising themselves as lazy. This is painful for me when I hear it, because I hear the tone of voice that they use when they say it. It's often one of scathing disdain and frustration. So I want to start explaining my take on laziness and comfort eating. Firstly, I think it's vital to start to change this tone of voice from one of disdain for yourself to one of curiosity and compassion. This is something you'll hear me encourage you to do all the time. Just have a check on what it would be like if you started asking yourself, what is it that makes me want to be lazy? And I'm putting lazy in inverted commas here. And sit on the sofa and eat rather than do anything else. Instead of, I'm such a lazy cow, all I can do is eat. What the hell is wrong with me? I'm so frustrated. Can you see the difference or feel the difference here? One encourages exploration and so then possibly understanding and then maybe being able to do something, while the other is soon going to lead to self-hatred and angry eating. This is really destructive. So I'm asking you to stop and notice how you talk to yourself. It really makes a huge difference. Laziness, as far as I understand, is something that we all as humans have a natural propensity towards. We apparently want to conserve energy for only survival and pleasure. So just bear that in mind next time you call yourself lazy or you think someone else is judging you to be that. Being greedy is another way that people who overeat can level some kind of critic against themselves. Here's a comment I received once. I have in 5 minutes eaten a big bag of Maltesers and I'm struggling to understand why. I have feelings of numbness and not caring, but also guilt. I'm getting worse. I feel greed is a big thing as I've been greedy since I was a child. I just want to stop. I feel sad when I read this because I imagine this person feels desperation, frustration, confusion, upset. I'm guessing that most of you watching or listening to this can relate to this as well. I also noticed though that the person feels numbness when they eat, whilst at the same time accusing themselves of being greedy. But the two kind of cancel each other out really, as far as I'm concerned. Numbness inspires eating, or greed, and is also a result of it. Greed is a judgmental word, but greed could be described as an out-of-control desire to seek pleasure from food. Using the word greed in our respective cultures implies that there should be shame for doing this. As I was saying, with any self-criticism, this is definitely going to make you feel worse. So you can see here the relentless cycle of shame, eating, and numbness. You can see it so clearly. This person may have eaten those Maltesers for a whole host of reasons that we actually can't see, but what we can see is that at least one of those reasons was feeling bad about herself in the first place. In the back of her mind is the judgment, I'm greedy. What would your response be if someone said you were greedy? Would you be okay with it? Would you be happy about it? No, of course you wouldn't. Chances are that you would most likely feel angry, depressed, shame, or anxiety. I know if someone told me I was being greedy, I'd instinctively feel ashamed or angry. I would now, of course, be able to reason that I'm not greedy because I understand it differently, and that the word greed is really a derogatory term to use, and probably says more about the person saying that and their judgmental attitude than anything about me. But I might also still wonder, in my unconscious mind, whether I was being greedy. That's just normal. It's a direct path to shame. Being shamed. Shame comes when we're afraid that we don't fit in with people. So pretty quickly we have a whole host of feelings that are really difficult to manage, which is when you'll turn to food. So you might be wondering, what can you do about this? The first thing to understand is how you're criticising yourself. What kind of self-critic have you got? In my introductory videos and about comfort eating, I asked you to think about when it is that you overeat and what was happening just before. It's also really helpful to ask yourself exactly how you talked to yourself, because there's often a self-critic involved somewhere down the line. What are the exact words that you have in your head just before you give up? Are you putting yourself down in some way? What's the tone of voice like in your head? Are you being nasty to yourself or even bitchy? Do you have certain phrases that put you down that you repeat over and over again to yourself, thinking they're just the normal thing to do? Do you recognise any of these thoughts and behaviours? 1. Comparing yourself to others. 2. Perceiving only negative things about yourself and not feeling good enough. 3. Feeling guilty. 4. All or nothing thinking. 5. Focusing only on the negative. Or 6. Punishing yourself. I had one client who realised she was saying, "you silly cow," with pretty much everything she did. So she'd walk into a room and she'd think, "oh, you silly cow, you didn't do that very well." That's awful, right? I mean, that's really nasty. And she thought it was just normal and didn't realise. But it's also really typical. So typical, you might assume it's normal and okay to talk to yourself like that. But it is probably making you eat. The last thing I want to talk about here is childhood beliefs. Often what happens when you start exploring the reasons for overeating and your self-critic is that you find that the way you now treat yourself is a direct continuation of how you learnt to treat yourself early on. It's also an interpretation of how you were treated as a child. So the self-critic that you now have in your own head is a reflection of and a learned response to the criticism you perceived from a previous time in your life. In a nutshell, you internalized what you thought others thought of you. And this comes to the surface again when you feel people are thinking the same way of you, badly of you, in the present. Your self-critic can run so deep. Of course, it may also be that you learnt to feel bad about yourself from an early age because of the conditional love of your primary caregivers. In this case, you may ask yourself, How old were you when you first thought you weren't good enough? If your story is chronic, it is likely that these feelings came first when you were very, very young. The body brings back memories into the present over and over again, triggered by something similar. You could have interpreted not being good enough, not fitting in from different events in your history, from the perceived rejections of childhood and even birth. You could have interpreted disapproval from any criticisms or ideals that you felt you had to live up to in any of your relationships. This disapproval is registered and then becomes internalized. We can never get enough approval. In daily life, when your self-esteem takes a hit, you'll usually find it reflected in the way your family communicates. Thinking we're not good enough comes from trying to adhere to what other people value, historically or in the present. Generally, most of us try to please others. All of this needs unpacking with compassion and understanding in order to relearn how to be kinder to yourself so that you can shift those unconscious beliefs and to recover your natural resources and ways to feel better. Binge eating disorder is known to stem from a traumatic history, particularly developmental trauma. So comfort eating may not be complete in your recovery without healing from trauma or exploring it. Here is where shame in the body might have begun. You'll find a lot of my future videos will be about coping with developmental or relational trauma. Next week, I'm going to start talking about your inner child. What I've talked about here is about paying attention to how you're talking to yourself, especially around food. I mentioned that being self-critical might make you want to overeat more. Then I asked you to challenge your assumptions around laziness and greed. After that, I offered you some questions to start understanding your self-critic. Then finally, I introduced you to the idea that your critic might come from somewhere previous in your life. What's often missing in the mind of an emotional eater is a kind of self-concerned voice. You need to start asking yourself what you're really saying to yourself. Because calling yourself stupid, a cow, an idiot, even in passing, is never going to make you want to stop comfort eating and will actually only make you want to eat more. So start to notice all the ways that you give yourself a hard time. I'm willing to bet that it's a lot more than you realise. And if you want to comment here, I'd be really interested to hear what criticisms you level against yourself. And I know that you'd be giving permission to others, and you'd definitely be echoing what others feel. Belief in yourself is everything with comfort eating recovery. Because not far from comfort eating is usually feeling bad about yourself. It's underneath most harmful acts against the self and most emotional pain. Every single client in therapy will explore this in most sessions. So I'll leave you with this thought. Who really has the power to judge you? It's not your doctor, your teacher, your parents, or your partner, or even your boss. It's really only you.